Inking. It's a huge part of the traditional comic and manga process. Although most new illustrators that I've met don't really know why, and they have a tendency to use it without really understanding it. And new comic illustrators tend to ink very poorly. And I know this because that's what I struggled with most as a teenager, aside from the most horrifying figures you've ever seen, but because my dad bought these essential Marvel books. They were scanned from plates that only showed the inks, and seeing all the different approaches to that beautiful, stark, positive and negative space made me fall in love with inks, even though I was still bad at it. But the reason behind ink problems are rarely to do with the skill of the hand. They're usually more of a product of how the artist thinks about inks. So I'm going to lay out a philosophy of inks. I'm going to give you the 10 most valuable things I've learned while inking. Then I'm going to throw in a couple of bonus tips at the end, and I'm going to tell you through all of these things what has kept me inking through hundreds and hundreds of pages, especially over the last few years. What are inks for? As I said before, most of the real growth you have as an artist is more about the way that you think as opposed to what you do with the hand. Undeniably, you build up skill in your hand, but it's mostly about the eye and the mind and how you think about things that makes the biggest difference. And so, let's change the way we think about inking. First of all, and you'll hear this from lots of people, but inking is not tracing. But what inking is really is the part that's more elusive. Inking is apparition. It's when something appears with total, final clarity. The pencils you put in prior to this were just preparation for the ink. So if we're thinking about the drawing process as a funnel, this is the bottom. This is the last stage that spits out the final result. So think of inking as the final drawing of the process. It's not simply tracing pencils already laid down. The inks are the real deal. They're the final performance. The pencils just provide a platform to limit the mistakes in that final stage. Even within that understanding of inking, within that philosophy, there's a huge breadth of styles. Now, this is one of the things that becomes intimidating to new illustrators. What is the right path, or at least a good one, to follow? In general, ink styles tend to boil down into two different categories of ink's purpose. First, that ink demonstrates the contours of things. You see this most often with single weight line, very stylized and simplified. Second, that ink demonstrates the shadows of things. You tend to see this with more realistic work that uses brushes along with pen lines. And then third, that ink uses a combination of these two philosophies, using ink to clarify some shadows and some contours. If you imagine a scale between these two extremes on either side, sliding it back and forth from one side to the other will explain most of the inking styles that you encounter. It's just the artist articulating the proper mix according to their judgment and the intentions of their work. Well, if inking is so individualistic, you might think it can be hard to provide methods, techniques, or do's and don'ts that are broadly applicable. But actually, there's a lot I've learned in inking that can help just about anybody looking to understand inking better. So here are 10 things. Number 1, choose a light direction and stick to it. At the start of a page, you need to have a good sense of where the light is coming from. This might be less important to you if you're like me, and in the pencil stage, you're mostly worried about structure and detail rather than shadows. But whether in the pencil stage or in the ink, you should establish a light direction. If you have a light source nearby, like a lamp or a window, know where your characters are standing in reference to it. So even in dialogue, then, you can switch back and forth and have these shadows or line weight oriented in the proper direction. And if this is hard for you to hold in your head as you're drawing, doodle a little map and keep it aside to reference. Number 2, vary line weight based upon light. Not every comic illustrator likes to use heavy shadows, but even with relatively thin and consistent lines, you can still vary the weight of the line based upon the previously established light direction. Sometimes for me, this is just increasing the weight of the line on the underside of something. It's a small change, but it can make a huge difference when applied across the page. From a practical perspective, in terms of tools, this can mean just switching back and forth between a pen and a brush. A thin, fixed line comes from the pen, and a thick, tapered line from the brush. This can apply physically or digitally, especially because it's quite easy to find brush packs for things like Photoshop, Procreate, Clip Studio, and I'll put a link for some of my favorites down in the description. Number 3, create shadowed areas for depth. This one is a little bit more controversial because some artists just don't like doing it, but it's an easy and effective way to create depth within a section of the drawing, even if it's just on the figure. Making an arm stand away from the body just by dropping a shadow underneath, for example. It can help your reader read the panel without just seeing a clutter of lines. Blocks of black create separation. And this is an extension of the second tip because it also depends upon your light direction. It can also be a way to increase the drama in a scene. You can keep things bright and clear, or you can make the murky light that elicits mystery and drama, like the noir comics of the Golden Age. Number 4, wield straight and curved lines. If you look at a classic master comic artist like Will Eisner, his characters are composed of a beautiful mess of curvy brush lines. You also see a lot of great artists like Dave Finch, whose works look like a series of short, straight lines. But neither of these artists, and very few artists generally, are using exclusively the curves or the straight lines. It's a mix with a dominant and recessive theme. Some will use both and favor one more, and then vice versa. Intentionally mixing in straight lines with brushy curves in juxtaposition to each other is a great way to add dynamic life to your inks. Finding the right pattern, there's no trick or hack to it. You just have to study other inkers and ink a lot yourself until you discover a working rhythm. Number 5, create energy with gesture. If you start your pencil process with gesture, like I recommended in the pencil video, then inking is the stage when most artists ruin all the energetic work that they got put into the gesture stage, typically by a slow and hesitating ink process. Whether you're doing it digitally or traditionally, moving slow and too meticulously drawing lines will drain the life out of your figures. It will suck the energy from the page. There is a real benefit to working quickly, in the very least to laying down a line quickly. A hesitating, slow line isn't clean. It wobbles and it jitters, and that's rarely useful. A line laid down quickly is clean and energetic. It implies motion and life. With the big calligraphy-like lines you get with a brush, it's particularly obvious, but it applies with a pen as well. And sometimes I even double line with a pen to increase the movement and the life. The speed part of inking is done easily when you're doing digital. Simply drop the line down. If it's not right, hit Command-Z or Control-Z, depending on if you're Mac or PC, and you just undo the line. And then you repeat until you get it right. So you just swipe and undo and swipe and undo. When you're inking traditionally, you have to warm up. 10 to 15 minutes of inking with brush and pen on sketches prior to going to the actual page is a great way to get your hand moving with confidence so that you're not doing the halting and the hesitating. Because when you're working traditionally with ink, the mistakes you make are real mistakes. It's not just a button press to get rid of them. It's a lot of work, and sometimes you just have to live with them. When I'm working traditionally, I also tend to develop my pencils a little bit more just to give me a better platform for the inks. But mistakes are going to happen, and you just, in many ways, have to be okay with that. Ink is startlingly permanent when it's on paper. Recognize that some mistakes are just going to become part of the page, and ink boldly. Number 6, design your background. The goal of the background is emphasis. It's either emphasizing the place and it's entrenching the characters at a particular location, or sometimes it can be used through contrast to help give a stronger emphasis to motion and to emotion and action and movement. A lot of these factors and others will influence the way that you're handling a background. But the main principle at work here is contrast. The object or the figure in the foreground should contrast to the background and thereby make the panel easier to read. If a character is having a strong emotional response, I might drop shadows across the background to emphasize that reaction. If I'm having a standard scene where the characters are important but I still want to establish the location, I'll just use thinner lines to cause the background to recede and then use heavier ones up front. So again, the general principle is contrast. Regardless of what's happening in the background, design it to support and clarify what's happening in the foreground. And you can do that by making the background different in value, in shape, in texture, in weight, to push the foreground forward. If you look at a panel you've inked and it feels cluttered, trust that instinct. It's typically right. Shoot for comfort, not clutter. Number 7, visual hierarchy. The previous tip is an aspect of visual hierarchy because the hierarchy, the foreground elements, are supposed to be more important than the background elements. This principle, number 7, just emphasizes that it goes beyond the foreground and background. Some parts of your panel are just more important than other parts. The background is not always important. The face is not always important. The hands and what they're doing may not necessarily be important. And so not only with the crop of the panel do you indicate what's important and what's priority and what is not, but also with the way in which you draw the eye through contrast, through increases in line weight and shadow, how you frame and isolate certain elements of the panel. I'll admit this is a hard one for me. I seem to make more errors here than anywhere else on the list, but I'm working on it. The real mastery of inks, I think, is housed somewhere in this principle. Number 8, use the invisible line. For a long time, I had a temptation to close off all of my inks. I think I was probably taking contours too literally. Because even if that's your primary function, if you're mostly focused on contours, there's no reason all the lines have to be closed. The first time I really noticed this was in David Lloyd's work on V for Vendetta. He uses what's known as a color hold, where the line stops and the color creates the boundary of the figure. That whole concept of breaking the line is really the inverse of having heavier lines away from the light source. Close to the light source, when you break the line, it looks like the light is collecting in that spot, and because it's reflecting off of a surface, then you get less line visible. It makes perfect sense and kind of fits nicely with the whole mixture of contour and shadow that is being suggested by most ink styles. So it works best for anything that's facing towards the light source. Number 9, hatch cautiously and sparingly. I always connected the idea of inking with those old traditional illustrations of elaborately inked and cross-hatched images. In comics, however, the most common form is just hatching. It's a series of lines going the same direction that gives off the effect of a value between white and black. It is really important that you use this sparingly. When beginning illustrators use it, they almost inevitably overuse it. Hatching is typically used to enhance realism. So creating gray values that can be used to render out more realistically figures and backgrounds. But comics aren't necessarily very realistic. They're more stylized than real, partly because it makes the panels easier to read. Sometimes a high level of realism can actually make it more difficult to read a comic. So the particular medium of comics doesn't necessarily benefit from realism the way a huge striking painting might. Some comic artists will forego hatching almost entirely. David Mazzucchelli's Batman Year One uses lots of shadow, contour line, and white space, and tends to leave hatching very much on the sideline. But then other artists like the legendary Bernie Wrightson uses it much more willingly. But he's also one of the best in human history to ever pick up an ink brush. My advice is to use it sparingly. Learn to do without it, and then as you grow, you might find ways to integrate it little by little into your work. It's best first, I think, to master the use of positive and negative space, of simple black and white. Then just kind of let it leak into the work as you start to see a need for it. But if you are using it, here are a couple little tips to go along with it. First of all, always hatch in just one direction. Never scribble back and forth. It looks hairy and generally bad. Hatching in one direction gets the taper unidirectional, and it looks much better. Second, hatch towards the light. Start the hatch line away from the light source and end the hatch line in the direction of the light source. The thinner end from the taper will look more natural there. Third, do not cross-hatch, crossing over perpendicular to your existing lines. You will die suddenly. Maybe. In reality, it's just really hard to do, and I don't think you should do it until you start to feel really comfortable with inking in general. Cross-hatching is a high-level skill, and you should work up to it. There's a reason why I use it so sparingly. I'm not that good. Number 10, lean back and look at the whole. Comic art, especially when it's done digitally, can lead us to lean in and look at it really closely. Make sure that you come back regularly and look at the whole image. A comic page could be 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 panels. And those panels are not separate pieces of art. They are all components of the page, which is a piece of artwork in of itself. So when you're inking those panels, don't forget to zoom out and make sure that there's no confusion on the page. Look out for tangents between panels, that is, uncomfortable and unintentional connections that confuse the eye. Try not to let the ink in the panels confuse the reading order by putting a ton of black on the left and none on the right and so on. Design the page just like you design a singular panel, but as a collection of smaller pieces of artwork. And keep an eye on it, just kind of adjusting as you go. That's the 10 principles, but don't go. Like and subscribe so the algorithm will love me. And comment below too. Tell me who the best inkers in the world are. While you're doing that, I'll give 2 last pieces of advice. 1, ink is easy to overdo. Err on the side of being minimalist. A lot of inks can be extremely rich and detailed, but in my experience, it's easier to start with a more sparse approach and then move into a heavier and richer and more detailed approach, attempting again to master the design of areas of black and white. Starting overly detailed and then attempting to scale it down is, I think, more difficult. Some might argue with me there. I tend to ink a figure much more simply and then come back with another pass and add additional detail and maybe a little bit of value through some hatching. And I do that because I have a tendency to over-render characters. And finally, don't give up on traditional inks and just do digital. There is a wonderful terror that comes with the reality of working with ink on paper, where the ink is utterly permanent when you lay it down. It causes you to be very conscious and decisive about the moves that you make, and it also helps you fear mistakes less because you will inevitably make them. It's just enough out of your control to be good for you. So use real paper, use real ink, and really there's nothing quite like laying a brush of India ink down on a blank piece of Bristol paper. I'll put some link for some materials down below. And that's it. In the next video, we're going to be talking about color, which I'm really looking forward to. So subscribe, hit the little bell, so you know when that video comes out. And let me know too.